Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Professor Pascal Quester. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice President Academic at the University of Adelaide. I would first like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodian of the Adelaide Plains, and the land upon which the University of Adelaide's campuses, here on North Terrace, but also at Waite, Theberton and Roseworthy, are built. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to tonight's guest lecture presented by the University of Oxford Sir David Watson, entitled Does Higher Education Make You Think? Hope it's a rhetorical question. To say a few words of introduction, I now invite Professor Warren Bennington, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Adelaide, to say a few words.
Thank you, Pascal. Colleagues, members of Council, also a special welcome to colleagues from Flinders and the University of South Australia. Well, higher education is certainly making us think today as the House of Representatives in Canberra debates the most far-reaching reform package for universities in 30 years. I've just been asked if I've been watching it on the parliamentary channel, but no, because the outcome today is, as you know, formulaic. It will be much more interesting when it hits the Senate. It's my task to introduce our speaker. Sir David Watson has been Principal of Green Templeton College and Professor of Higher Education at the University of Oxford since October 2010. Prior to his current appointment, he was Professor of Higher Education Management at the University of London's Institute of Education and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Brighton for 15 years. Sir David is a highly regarded author with recent titles of his books including The Question of Conscience, Higher Education and Personal Responsibility, The Engaged University, and The Question of Morale, Managing Happiness and Unhappiness in University Life. He's contributed widely to developments in the United Kingdom's higher education sector, including as a member of the Council of National Academic Awards, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, and the National Committee of Inquiry into Higher Education, chaired by Lord Deering in the mid-1990s. He was elected Chair of the Universities Association for Continuing Education in 1994, chaired the longer-term strategy group of Universities UK, and till 2012 served as Honorary President of the Society for Research into Higher Education. He's a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, a companion of the Institute of Management, and a National Teaching Fellow. He was knighted in 1988 for services to higher education, and a decade on, in 2009, he received the Times Higher Education Lifetime Achievement Award. So David joins us tonight during a lightning visit to Australia and following a series of strategic workshops on ethical governance for the Association of Commonwealth Universities in Perth earlier this week. So ladies and gentlemen, to speak on the topic, Does Higher Education Make You Think? It's my great pleasure to introduce Sir David Watson.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my new book, and I hope the ideas in it will have some resonance for your situation. Most Wither higher education lectures these days are about a narrow range of interconnected big questions. Developing national systems, funding institutions and students, maintaining quality in a mass environment, being world-class, underpinning national, regional and individual prosperity, and an important subtext, the immiseration of the academic profession. With your indulgence, I'd like to focus elsewhere today. I'd like to talk in a rather old-fashioned way about higher education and personal responsibility. Higher education is a noble and long-standing enterprise. And yet in a curious way, it's not been a particularly self-reflective one. Especially in times of economic or political difficulty, the scholarly community has been more ready to analyse and to campaign about what is being done to it than about what it does to itself, and especially to its most important members, its students. One result is that we can focus on issues like funding, economic returns on investment, relative institutional prestige and the like, and ignore what tutors and researchers working directly with students frequently hear in interviews. They hear the phrase, "It changed my life." Thick, descriptive, observational accounts abound with evidence like this. One of the most compelling is the one I've put up here, Jennifer Case's account of 14 non-standard entrants to the prestigious chemical engineering course at the University of Cape Town. This case study is an example of a no-compromise maintenance of academic standards reinforced by highly supportive teaching and pastoral provision. Essentially what the university, a historically white institution, did shortly after apartheid ended, they recruited a group of students onto this prestigious course designed to reflect the demography of the new nation. And it worked. They were followed through their course by Jennifer Case. And these quotations all come from interviews she conducted with them 10 years after they had graduated. This is where the effects of higher education, I think, really are best measured. She found that all bar 2 had graduated. 10 of them were still working in the field broadly defined by chemical engineering. They all looked back on their higher education not necessarily with joy. As you can see from these phrases here, for many of them it was a particularly tough proposition. But I think you have to say that this is evidence of people being able to say, "It changed my life." I particularly like the last one, the young woman who said, "Now you can bring me anything at any time. I can handle it, I don't flinch, I just say bring it. I have been through hell before." And she was talking about being a student. Melanie Walker and Ron Barnett have attracted similar testimony across the range of student types of experience in the UK. The first one here from Melanie's book is of a mature student, a mother, who has re-entered higher education somewhat later in life. "I feel more confident and comfortable. I have goals and hope now." And the second is a female engineering graduate. "I've graduated a different person from when I entered, better equipped for all aspects of life." This conclusion about this feeling of the transformative power of higher education is reinforced and given statistical force by some larger surveys. For example, the fourth sweep of the remarkable Future Track cohort investigated by Kate Purcell and others. This is a cohort study of as many students as could be gathered who entered higher education in 2006 in the UK, around 30,000 cases. And the cohort study has been maintained. These were the students who graduated into the teeth of the recession. And the fourth sweep, which still has around 12,500 students responding to it, find a comfortable majority saying that if they had their time over, they would do it again. So I offer you that as the philosophical background to some of the points that I want to make. But I want to spend a few more introductory minutes on the longer view, about the history of higher education and how these things fit in. My conclusion is that the history of higher education is essentially geological. Strata are laid down at different times and in different ways and for different purposes. But once these types of institution are established, they are irremovable. The next stratum sits on top of them. In some parts of the university world, some of the older ones are still nearer the surface than others. You can extend the geological metaphor. Pipes connect some of them directly with layers further down. There are many modern institutions who like to draw on what they see as the ethos of much earlier foundations. Tectonic plates can sometimes form between them, which move slowly and create major disruption. Note that the key divisions are not between public and private institutions. Privately funded higher education has played a role throughout this process. What is new is the last one here. It's the for-profit part of the business, the discovery by major corporations of an opportunity through higher education to create dividends and shareholder value. So I offer you these types of historical foundation, the original late medieval specialist communities, a long period of fallow development in terms of new institutional types, during which, of course, much science and investigation took place outside the university framework. The next big wave of development with regional and national institutions serving post-industrial society. Then in the 20th century, the development of major public systems of higher education. Late 20th century development, particularly of innovative forms making use of information and communications technology. A much more sophisticated understanding of the general tertiary framework more recently, trying to find the right relationships between further and higher education, and then for profits. Here are two familiar worked examples of these layers in practice. You can read across functionally here, but not necessarily chronologically. For example, the colonial seminaries that became the big institutions in the Ivy League began really as Calvinist forcing houses for young men. The curriculum at Princeton and Harvard was about creating the circumstances in which a conversion experience could be brought about for young men. In that era, there was a compulsory course in almost all of these seminaries, which was a course on moral philosophy taught by the university president. I've often thought that that's an innovation that might be brought back. You know, the head of each institution should be required to teach a course on moral philosophy. But they performed something of the same role in this story as Oxford and Cambridge, Paris and Bologna. Professional defensive communities that during the course of the 19th century modified to become major research institutions. The links between the Victorian and Edwardian civics and the land grant institutions at about the same time in the US. The public sector of higher education leading to polytechnics and colleges in the UK, linking with state systems in the US, and so on. I contend that this pattern of higher education development is almost universal, with different societies joining in at different times. For example, you can plot onto it the Latin American religious foundations, which are very similar to the first bullet here. The Chinese and Japanese so-called imperial universities look very like the big civics. The Australian sandstones share some of those characteristics. State systems in the developing world picked up a lot of the public sector state system ethos and made particular use of information and communication development. John Daniels' notion of the mega universities that operate in the subcontinent. Now, I offer you that as a historical background against which I want to track some other changes. Throughout this process, universities have set out at least 10 separable sets of purposes, at least 10 types of claims to transform the lives and transform the experience of the people who they bring in as students. The first is religious, and it acknowledges the role of higher education in confirming faith and from time to time inspiring it, as I've said, through conversion. Doctrinal and even dogmatic instruction is central there. The second kind of claim is about personal development. And there's a string of evocative descriptors here: self-realization, self-discovery, self-creation, and so on. This links with a discourse about establishing the authenticity of the individual actor. And pedagogically here, the key is independent learning. The third kind of claim is more social. It looks at the ways in which an individual improves his or her relationship with the wider world, culturally, economically, politically, and so on. This can end up with a form of education for citizenship, including, these days, world citizenship. It incorporates other pedagogies, such as, for example, service learning. The fourth kind of claim is about technical know-how. where higher education, often in combination with other forms of recognition, essentially attests the ability of a graduate to be able to perform certain functions at specified levels. The fifth links with that, but incorporates the wider question of professional acculturation, membership of a profession, being a doctor, being a teacher, being a probation officer, thus aligns with membership of the university. The sixth kind of claim emphasizes the relationship of the student to his or her peers, whether or not that's structured through an intended profession. Many of the longer-term effects of higher education are claimed to be through networks. You will see some courses in business, particularly international MBAs, saying that the thing that you will get out of this course is what used to be your Rolodex, but is now actually your LinkedIn profile of all the people with whom you studied, who will be useful to you for the rest of your life. So these networks, established or discovered at university, can be relied on, in this theory, for the remainder of careers or even the rest of life. The seventh claim focuses on accelerated maturation, or time and space to grow up. It's often seen as connected with moving away from home. And of course, for many part-time and an increasing number of full-time, especially older students, that doesn't formally apply. An eighth draws on the seventh through the notion of protected time, stressing that higher education is potentially an interval. Michael Oakeshott famously described higher education as the gift of an interval. You're taken out of society for a period of time and placed in a set of protected circumstances. If there's some ivy in the quadrangle, it generally helps. And then when you've finished, you're released back again into the world. The ninth is about subjects and disciplines, independent of their professional or applied settings. Many students are drawn into higher education by an inspiring teacher at secondary level, or by love of the subject. Once they're in, and once they're beyond their institutional experience, they then get impaneled in campaigns to protect or promote their subject. It's very interesting. If you ask a lot of adults what they are, they will often reply by describing the course that they took as an undergraduate. I'm a chemist, even though you may not in fact be working anywhere near chemistry anymore. I'm a historian. I meet lots of people in pubs who describe themselves as historians too. The final strand, the final one of these claims, is perhaps best summed up as mental gymnastics. There are claims that higher education is more demanding than educational levels that precede it, and in many cases follow it. And this, I have to say, like all of the elements on this list, is at least contested. Lucy Callaway, has anybody read Lucy Callaway? Lucy Callaway is a columnist in the Financial Times. She writes about business life. She often broadcasts on the BBC World Service too. And she has a wonderful sense of what is going on in business life. And I steal one of the sections from one of her columns in the book, where she goes into her kitchen and she finds her two daughters revising for their exams. And she says, I have never felt more misery in a room in any circumstances. So she makes them a cup of tea and she says, nothing you ever do again in your life will be as hard as this. And she explains how this is true, because you are on your own at this point in terms of testing your exit standard from a qualification like a degree in a way that you very rarely are in professional or business life. So that's my basic taxonomy of what I've found about transformation claims made by higher education institutions over this period. If you put them together, there's a number here about the role of higher education in existential terms, how participants come to be who they are, in epistemological terms, how they think and appraise information, in behavioral terms, how they learn to conduct themselves, and in positional terms, including through competition and collaboration. The validity and the applicability of these claims will vary over time, by institutional setting, by subject and mode of study, according to the expectation of funders, sponsors, and other stakeholders, and critically in terms of the approach taken by the student himself or herself. But I think it's quite important to establish where these claims came from, how much contemporary resonance any of them still have, and whether or not they can actually combine, or some subset of them combine, to create a kind of moral compass for graduates, a form of personal responsibility. Here's, and just, does anybody want to comment? Does anyone want to say rubbish about any one of those, or to add an 11th, or? But do you recognise that broad set of claimed intentions for higher education? Here's some data about how a set of students, in fact, rank them. What I've done here is I actually gave this list to 2 different groups of postgraduate students working on courses in higher education, one in Oxford and one at the University of London. And the exercise was called, Does Higher Education Do What It Says on the Tin? And so I gave them this tin of higher education and asked them to assign points against these 10 in terms of what they thought were important about their experience, these are postgraduate students, of their undergraduate courses. And I think it's quite interesting. Note the very strong consensus at the top on personal development and on creating friendships and networks. That's followed by social and political engagement, love of a subject. Other things, come further down the list. Technical competence and professional acculturation, for example. I did have one student who gave all 3 of his votes to religious confirmation because he came from a Catholic university at his undergraduate level in Belgium. And that was seen as very important in terms of what they set out. This group of 41 students also did come up with 1 or 2 others. 2 of them talked about the influence of a particular teacher as actually being formative in terms of transforming their experience. And experience of another country was also seen as very important by 1. And one person said, I can't really do this because I had an awful time as an undergraduate, and I don't think it made any difference to me at all. Now, I'm not going to scale that up across the whole of the higher education system and tell you how many students that's true of. But I think this is an interesting reality check that shows just how strong these views can still be. Stepping back, I'd like to suggest that they can in fact be structured around 5 sets of questions. And these are the 5 main sections in the book. These are the 5 main analytical categories. Most of these were around in one way or another at the beginning of the European university enterprise, the model that began in the 12th and 13th century and has been imitated elsewhere around the world. And since then, as I've said, they've waxed and waned and combined in different ways. The first set is around conscience, especially around religious foundations. The second set is around character, especially as formed through liberal higher education in the mould of Newman and others. The third combines calling, competence and craft, especially in the zones of professional and vocational higher education, which again were there from the beginning. The Paris theologians were professionals. The Bologna lawyers were professionals. The fourth set involves citizenship, as in respective obligations to civil society, the state, and global responsibilities. And the final set, in much more recent theoretical terms, introduces capability, especially in the sense that it's used by Amartya Sen. The role of higher education in inculcating life skills, among which, of course, employability may very well be one. Now, most of the claims about the purposes and achievements of higher education are irreducibly individualistic, that one of these things or a combination of these things will happen to you. It will change your life through conversion or confirmation of faith, by improving your character, by giving you marketable abilities, by making you a better member of the community, or simply being more capable of operating in the modern world. And all of these qualities, of course, scale up in different ways. That then raises the question about what endures in this process. Is there a kind of psychological contract between the university and its members? If much of this is about changing priorities, how do we tackle the question of what Einstein called a cosmological constant? What doesn't change in this process? What are the commitments which are consistent throughout? Lord Eric Ashby, who began his career as Professor of Botany at the University of Sydney, before going on to be Vice-Chancellor at Queen's Belfast and then Cambridge, thought that higher education should have its own Hippocratic oath, that there ought to be some set of values signed up to as you join the institution. And I've played with this idea over a number of years, and here's a response to the Ashby challenge in the form of a set of 10 potential commandments for higher education. The first 2 are about the core business. These are about how we work. We're working in institutions that are truth-seeking, and we are working in disciplined ways to establish as far as we can that truth. The remaining 8 are about how we ought to behave inside institutions in order to achieve, in particular, the first 2. And I'd like to work through these for the next few minutes with you so that we can test how robust they are. There is, of course, an old joke about Moses coming down from the mountain with the tablets and saying to the people of Israel, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that I kept her down to 10. The bad news is that adultery is still in. Here, the good news is that I've managed to keep it down to 10, but accountability is still in, and I'll get to that in just a minute. If these commandments represent our core values, what is it that actually threatens them? I think in the contemporary university world, each of these poses a particular set of dilemmas. And I'm going to work through them and identify how there are these characteristic dilemmas, each one of which you'll see begins with A, although I did strain a bit to make that work. So I shall come back to each of those. Let's take, first of all, commandment number 1, strive to tell the truth. Academic freedom, in the sense of following difficult ideas wherever they might lead, is possibly the fundamental academic value. And academic freedom is in one sense synonymous with free speech, but it also involves some additional strictures. It's about disciplined speech. It's about using all the techniques that are available to us to strive to tell the truth as effectively as possible. The main practical dilemma here relates to autonomy. How in those circumstances do universities use their autonomy as distinct, differentiated institutions in modern society? Autonomy is seen as the foundational quality of modern European universities. On the 800th anniversary of Bologna, university leaders from around the world met and re-signed a Magna Carta for the university, emphasizing the central value of autonomy. Humboldt talked about the founding principles of the university being operating in loneliness and freedom, separate from the rest of society. How do we live up to that? Well, not always very well is the answer to that. In the UK, we have had particular dilemmas about autonomy. British universities are the most autonomous in the world. We own all our own assets, we employ our own staff, we renew our leadership ourselves without any kind of prescription from outside. What's more, that autonomy is owned at the institutional level. So there are, for example, no legislative forces that can persuade or can require the university as a whole to follow the precepts of one part of the university, which can often happen in continental European universities. But British universities, for many decades, kept this strong commitment to autonomy alongside an addiction to earmarked funding and special initiatives. So you had this strange phenomenon that universities would say, we are entirely autonomous, there are these really important things we need to do, but you have to give us more money to do them. So the most important thing that a university might want to do, it would declare was not possible within its core resources. The government would have to fund particularly a special initiative. And we had a raft of special initiatives over several decades. And lots of things went wrong. There was generally a fund after the argument had been won. The wrong people won, so everybody else complained. And even when the special initiative came to an end, there would be a problem because those institutions that had won would still have recurrent commitments but no resources with which to support them. So we began to compromise around autonomy. It has to be said that post-2008, with one or two highly politicized exceptions, special initiatives have come to an end in the UK. And universities now have to determine themselves what the most important priority they want to spend their disposable margins on are, rather than engaging in those kinds of campaigns. So there's a dilemma surrounding Commandment 1. Commandment number 2, take care in establishing the truth. Adherence to various kinds of scholarly method are important here. Falsifiability, the concept of social scientific warrant, the search for authenticity in the arts and humanities. And these all raise the time-old question about C.P. Snow's two cultures, which I have to say are these days breaking down. I think there are many elements of rapprochement between the two cultures, many of them, for example, by information and communication technology. But another key dilemma is the borderland that is then set up between analysis and advocacy. In science, as Richard Feynman put the point brilliantly, when you have a good idea, your first obligation is to think about everything that might be wrong with it. It is not your first obligation to think, how can I sell this to other people? And we often fall into a process where we move too swiftly from analysis to advocacy without actually fully establishing the grounds for our conviction. Corruption is another problem here too. Corruption is the worm in the apple. It actually calls the whole project into question. We often think that corruption is something that happens elsewhere in the world, but there are many examples of slippery slope, unsatisfactory practice in universities that lead us down the wrong path. Will, for example, the Chinese drive for institutions to have world-class status be undermined by the evidence about scientific fraud and dishonesty? There is a danger in assuming that corruption is solely or largely a presence in the southern or developing world, connected with the wider abuse of power, the maldistribution of resources, and the absence of Western-style institutional and professional traditions. That's a mistake. The West, the North, and the systems established there all have problems. The next dilemma and the next commandment, be fair. This is about equality of opportunity, non-discrimination, perhaps even affirmative action. Along with freedom in the academic value system goes respect for persons. And this is where attitude and civility matters. Collegiality, civility are often presented as core academic values. We do not necessarily live up to them consistently. And that's why we need things like negotiated speech codes and the like. The next one, this is the tricky one. Always be ready to explain. Academic freedom is a First Amendment and not a Fifth Amendment right. It's about freedom of speech. It's not about protection from self-incrimination. It doesn't absolve any member of the academic community from the obligation to explain his or her actions, and as far as possible, their consequences. Accountability is thus inescapable and should not be unreasonably resisted. It should also be exercised with care. Academics need to resist the temptation to abuse their authority by expressing definitive views in areas where they know little. It's one of my laws of academic life that academics gain in confidence the further they are away from their true field of expertise. Think about that. If you talk to somebody about what they're working on, it will be provisional. More research will be needed. It remains highly complex. But because we live in these very flat, professionally argumentative communities, everybody has an opinion about what is going down on the corridor, what is going on down the corridor, and the quality of the decision-making that the senior management team exhibited last week. Marcus Aurelius was, as usual, I think, really incisive in this area, urging us to treat with respect our power to form an opinion. Think too about panels of experts. Most universities have panels of experts where you can go on the website and you can find somebody to brief you about anything. I've discovered that universities are not particularly disciplined about establishing those panels, and they are often solely on the basis of self-asserted credentials. The next one, number 5. Do no harm. This is where assessment of consequences cashes out. It presents perhaps our nearest equivalent to the Hippocratic Oath itself, to strive not to harm, to help. This is about non-exploitation, either of human subjects or the environment. It underpins a lot of other notions which are very important in academic life, like progressive engagement, around which Peter Singer had some important ideas. It really helps with wicked issues, like the use of animals in medical experiments. The key here, and the dilemma here, is anticipation and careful assessment of consequences. And as with many such injunctions, there are also potential downsides. I've recently examined an Oxford doctoral thesis by a young man called Ali Qassam Remtula. And what he was looking at was the establishment of Muslim chaplaincies by elite American institutions. And in the course of this, he develops the theory of the anticipatory university. This is a university, this is a set of universities almost seeking to outbid each other by getting in first with what is seen to be a desirable development without really thinking about what they want to do with it. And you get a lot of risk aversion and a lot of imitative behavior in the anticipatory university. Number 6, keep your promises. Well, universities are engaged in a variety of contracts and partnerships. And in general, I would have to say, our record is good. If you look at the track record of large-scale partnerships between university institutions and, for example, major businesses and corporations, if they fall apart, it is very rarely the university that leads the table. The university does not use the kind of examples that the private sector can often use about changes in the business cycle or changes of management and so on. Universities are more regularly in there for the long term. But we get other things not quite so effective. There's an element here, for example, of truth in advertising, not least in relation to the engagement with the student market. I used to do an exercise with my students on the MBA course in Higher Education Management at the Institute of Education, where I would get them, these are all relatively senior managers in higher education, to bring in their undergraduate prospectuses. And we would look at the unique selling points claimed by each of these. We discovered that there were, in fact, only 6. This is a bit like that famous story that there are only 7 stories in the world. There are only 6 basic claims of unique things that universities do, and every university does 4 of them. We discovered one year, for example, that of the over 120 institutions that had university in the title that year, something just over 30 were in the top 10 for employability. Now, those of you who've done Statistics 101 will know that that is just possible on the basis that a very large number of them are ninth equal. But it gives you an example of a slippery slope there. And here's an interesting story. Does anybody here recognize the man on the right? The takeaway prize goes to this. It's Clay Christensen, who is the theorist of disruptive innovation, professor at the Harvard Business School. And Clay Christensen, writing in the New York Times, tells this fantastic story about how he was engaged by the University of Phoenix to give some lectures on marketing. And you can actually find these on YouTube. So he arrives, and these lectures are going to be streamed to 130,000 students around the Phoenix network. And he begins to deliver his lecture. He's in this fantastic environment with a view of Boston Harbor over his shoulder. And he looks out at his audience. And he says to himself, I have never seen a collection of more beautiful people in a room in my life. It's extraordinary. Everybody here is very, very good looking. He delivers his lecture. It doesn't go down terribly well because the audience doesn't quite sort of engage with his jokes, and certainly there are no questions. But later on, in the coffee queue in the hotel, he asks one of the students, how do you think it went? You know, how was I? And the member of the audience says, well, you know, I'm not sure I've really got an opinion. You've got to realize, he said, we aren't students, we're models. And they had been engaged by the University of Phoenix to sit there being lectured to by Clay Christensen while being streamed to all of these students who are probably in quite cramped accommodation upstairs in shopping malls throughout the United States. Now, is that how a university should behave? Is that a university set of values about keeping your promises about what is really going on? Number 7, respect your colleagues, your students, especially your opponents. Working in an academic community means listening as well as speaking, seeking to understand the other point of view, ensuring that rational discourse is not derailed by prejudice, by egotism, or by bullying of any kind. Academic life is inescapably competitive. We're in a hugely competitive, cutthroat business, but we manage this competition through deeply collaborative and mutually supportive systems. This is not the kind of competition designed to drive out all of the opposition. If all of the competitive grants in a scientific area ended up in one laboratory, the enterprise would actually come to an end. The nearest analogy I can think of this is a book from the 1970s, which became very important in management circles, which is a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. Does anybody remember reading The Inner Game of Tennis? By Timothy Galway. And Galway points out that tennis is one of the most competitive man-on-man, woman-on-woman games in the world. But it's also deeply collaborative. It's the only game where you warm up your opponent. You know, when the Wimbledon finalists arrive on the court, they have their 5 or 10 minutes of approved warm-up. If one of them feels a little shaky on his overheads, he'll ask the other person to send him up a few more overheads. There is no other game that works like that. The English cricket team was never able to invite Shane Warne over to their nets, you know, to have a little bit of practice just to see what they might face half an hour later. Everybody knows that in top quality tennis, in top professional tennis, a player could always win a point at any time by serving underhand, because the game is played at such speed now that the players are so far apart from each other that if you were a real rotter, you could just tap the ball over the net and you'd get your point. It's been done once or twice, and the community never forgot it. This is a deeply collaborative as well as competitive operation. And things can go seriously wrong here. We've got some real problems in the UK at the moment with what I call the gangs, which are the subsets, the voluntary organisations across higher education that say our set of universities actually represent not only the sector as a whole, but the best of what goes on in the sector as a whole. Our problem is the Russell Group. The Russell Group now has 24 members, and we now know that the way you get into the Russell Group is by giving them £500,000, because that's what happened when the last 4 joined. And on the Russell Group site it says, this is the association of the 24 most research-intensive universities in the UK. Empirically, it's just not. There are many institutions not on that list, far more research-intensive than those that are. By the most secure measure of research intensity, the bottom rustler is 57th on the list of British universities. So we have this kind of problem of an arms race, and we do have the problem in the UK that the Russell Group has very effectively persuaded not only the media but also the government that somehow it has a special position in the system. Number 8, sustain the community. All these values are deeply communal. Obligations that arise are not just to the subject or professional community, but to the family of institutions that actually make up the sector nationally and internationally. This kind of higher education ambiance, the reputational range of what is done across the system as a whole, belongs to us all. Number 9, guard your treasure. Universities guard a lot of treasure. Universities have galleries, we have collections, we have special facilities which are of deep and important cultural significance to the communities that surround us. As large influential institutions, universities are inescapably in the heritage business. We store important things on behalf of the community as a whole, and we ought to make them available when and how they're needed. It's interesting that the arrival of mass higher education has coincided, it may even have helped to create a context in which access to these is no longer exclusively on the HEI's terms. If you look in the UK at any major planning application that is eventually successful for a new development, like a sports facility, a gallery, a concert hall, and so on, part of the conditions of its approval are invariably now public access and public enjoyment. These things belong to everybody. Finally, number 10, never be satisfied. This is perhaps the academic equivalent of the golden rule. Academic communities understood the principles of continuous improvement long before they were adopted by the management literature. When I was Vice-Chancellor at Brighton, the Anglican chaplain came to see me one day. He'd noted that the university's teaching and learning conference was coming up shortly, and he said, I'd like to give a paper. And I said, fine. I said, what will it be about? He said, I would like to give a paper about mercy. He said, because I've looked at all these official documents, and this is a merciless institution. This is an institution for which nothing other than continuous improvement will be possible. The academic project will never be complete or perfect. Think about truth-telling. As we approach the line, it becomes an asymptote. It begins to bend, and we never quite get there. This isn't easy, of course, and it's often uncomfortable. Glyn Davis of the University of Melbourne writes in his wonderful book, The Republic of Learning, about the academic's nagging worry that somehow, somewhere, somebody is doing it better. It is actually a part of the psychological circumstances. Elaine Showalter quotes a colleague from the University of Texas, a professor of gender studies called Anne Shvetovich, who writes, academe breeds particular forms of panic and anxiety, leading to what gets to be called depression. The fear that you have nothing to say, or that you can't say what you want to say, or that you have something to say but it's not important enough or smart enough. At its more principled level, this is a kind of Talmudic professional worrying. The truth is there, and we'll strive to discover it, but as we approach it, we know that it will move away. And even the postmodernists can take some satisfaction from that dilemma. Now, thinking about that set of 10 commandments, an important consideration is how far they're culturally specific. Are they inescapably nested in a Western, perhaps even an Anglo-Saxon, essentialist view of the context and conditions of a university culture? There are some alternatives. Traditional and complementary medicine presents one form of alternative. Mysticism, where scientific has to defer to artistic understanding, another. Aspects of the Confucian tradition, a third. The artist and educator Zhu Bing states, and I quote, "Plagiarism does not exist in a Chinese traditional culture." And he's talking there about training in art, where drawing manuals are redrawn from the master without formal attribution in generation after generation. And the techniques and approaches of postmodernism are fourth. But I think most of these commandments will work almost everywhere except where the institution's primary purpose is dogmatic instruction. At least since the Enlightenment watershed, systematic reference to and validation by revealed religion will undermine these agreed modes of inquiry, but otherwise they will work. Evolutionary science and the geological record is an acid test. They do, I argue, represent values and powerful continuities. They allow for necessary change, and they instruct us as to when and how we need to restore and repair our commitments. They are, of course, a counsel of perfection. Oh, I knew I was going to do that. Oh, there we are. And to return in the last couple of minutes to my overarching question, linked to the claim, "It changed my life." Is higher education, in this context, likely to make you better? To improve your capacity to make sound moral as well as technical judgments? In other words, to take part in what Amartya Sen calls public reasoning. What do students actually get, and what do they deserve? I think most teachers in higher education would, if pushed, agree that they are working to a core curriculum at a high level of generality. As you study at this level, you try to answer some hard questions, some hypothetical, some not. You learn to work with other people, dead and alive, directly and indirectly through their work, present or remote. You meet deadlines. You ask yourself why you're doing this and what difference doing it well will make for you and for others. You get a certificate as a whole or in stages. You take out a membership. And in this way, higher education's purposes come together in terms of self-creation and the authentic life, the habit of thinking deeply, and the capacity to connect with others empathically. At the end of the day, of course, everyone makes sense of his or her higher education, not necessarily immediately, and in some cases, not for some considerable time. Think back to my first slide from the Jennifer case study. You don't have to buy the full proposition if you don't want to. There's a definite conscience or escape clause away from doctrinal study that says no one can make you take away what you don't want to. But you are compelled by an authentic higher education to practice answering difficult questions. You're given a safe place in which to do so, and depending on your subject or discipline or combination of these, you'll gain a powerful evaluative toolkit. You'll be required to communicate what you've learned. This is hard work, but for centuries, participants have found it immensely satisfying, and it has generally helped to make the world a better place. I'd be very interested in knowing what you think about all of this. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sir David. You've certainly raised some very pertinent questions and ideas, not least the suggestion that our Vice-Chancellor might want to teach first-year students moral philosophy in order to achieve conversion. We now have the opportunity for a few questions. There's a couple of mics that will be available, and if you raise your hand, we'll make them available to you. So please feel free to ask some questions.
Thank you, David. It was a great talk. It's essentially about the behavior and the way you operate within a university. So do you think if you were trying to characterize a university, indeed, does it have a character? Is it merely the assembly of all these behaviors across all the disciplines evolving over time? Or should a university, as many do these days, seek to have their mission statement, what is characteristic about our university?
Yeah.
Is it possible to achieve that whole of university description?
Yeah.
Or is it merely our ability to adhere to these very appropriate principles that you described?
I think the principles operate. I use the shorthand of a core curriculum. The principles operate as testing points for how effective we are being in fulfilling our generic mission as a higher education institution. Going back to what I tried to show historically, and particularly in relation to the different kinds of transformation claims, then I think institutions have historically and can still today carve out aspects of what they offer students in particular, which might be of more or less appropriateness or value for them. But I don't think those choices in any way undermine any of those key 10 points that I want to make there. In terms of missions, I'm comfortable with missions. I'm less comfortable with brand and with strap lines. And I find that institutions that seek very, very radically to narrow the scope of where they're working can often find that they are falling into some of these traps, including in particular the truth in advertising trap. An institution that might say, the only thing we're going to do is get you a job, let's say, that's really not going to be very convincing unless people do get jobs, and it may be extremely narrowing in relation to the broader set of values that's actually here. I mean, my view, and this is a different lecture in a way, is that in a curious kind of way, institutions are not becoming more differentiated, they're becoming less differentiated. Large, comprehensive institutions are now becoming much more hybrids of the range of possibilities about what universities do across the piece. And as a consequence, really effective institutions need to be able to sustain a number of convincing narratives about what's going on inside, not just a single narrative. Indeed, you could have a single narrative that says the narrative is that we can tolerate many narratives. So I think these do work, and I don't think they undermine strategic choices that institutions might make about their business mix. But you've got to be very careful when the business mix might cause you to knock one of them off course. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, that's one of them.
Thank you. So David, thank you very much for this lecture. I'm Maciej Henneberg. I have worked in 5 universities on 4 continents,
yes,
in 3 different languages.
Yes.
And I found your lecture enlightening because it actually summed up what all those institutions felt they were doing and what we were doing there. But I have a question as well. And this is about autonomy.
Yes.
The autonomy is at an institutional level, but it can't be realized without individual autonomy
Correct.
of academics.
Yes.
And I feel that management systems at some universities are actually stifling academic autonomy. So I'd just like to know your opinion.
Yes. Well, that's precisely why, in relation to each of these, I tried to show a core value and the ways that it can come under pressure. And so I was actually agreeing with you. I was saying that in empirical terms, the way that autonomy is analysed and interpreted might be undermining of Commandment 1, whereas in fact, the theory, as you know, going back to the Magna Carta and going back to Humboldt, is that actually it's only guaranteed by the truth telling commandment is only really guaranteed by autonomy. I think we just need to think really hard about autonomy. I do take your point that autonomy operates at various levels, and I do talk about that in a little bit more detail in the book. Yeah. Have I right.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. We hear in some scholarship of a time of enormous and profound change in higher education. So we can log on to YouTube and see the video of the man who proclaims the demise of all but 3
yes.
North American universities and so on, and the tremendous challenges of new pedagogies and new students, in a sense, students with much greater focus on their outside lives and so on. Do you think that we are really in a time of profound change to universities, or do you think that we're just adapting in our own way to slightly different worldviews, but within predominantly the same situation of a university within public life?
Yes. Frustratingly, my answer is going to be yes to both of your propositions. You may be referring, and I do unpick in as much detail as I can, the argument made by Michael Barber, who wrote a very influential pamphlet called An Avalanche is Coming, in which he basically said the modern university model is shot, and he has a series of 5 or 6 reasons why that's so. My contention is actually the university system does not do avalanches. It doesn't get buried by avalanches. If it did get buried by avalanches, let me just go back for a second. Oops. Model number 1 would never have survived the Reformation and humanism. You know, model number 2 would never have survived in industrialism. Model number 3 would never fully have survived the arrival of the internet. You know, model number 6 would never have survived a broader concept of mass post-compulsory education. Whether we can survive the 4 prophets is actually another issue, and I could talk about that later. But what has happened is that the university system has been profoundly adaptive. And I don't use that as a kind of glib response to these major changes. It is actually extraordinary that something that is still recognizably scholarly activity has managed to come out from under all of those avalanches, remodel shape. I mean, there's been a series of moral panics. I think they're over now, but there was a series of moral panics 2012, early 2013 about MOOCs, about massive online open courses. And you know, a number of voices said, this is the end. You know, this is the business model is shot. And actually, if you look at major developments in technology-enabled higher education, we've endured changes like that fairly regularly over the last century and a quarter. And they find their place, these new developments find their place, often mediated by students. Students are often the leaders on this. I could share with you the fact that my Vice-Chancellor at the University of Oxford called a meeting of us all and said, what are we going to do? Will Oxford work with MOOCs? And I said, too late, Vice-Chancellor. You know, we've got students all over the place who are using bits and whole sections of MOOCs. I had some students in my college who had deliberately as a group enrolled on a MOOC in order to study it through an MBA course, and brought Dr. Paul Kim from Stanford, who did this very famous MOOC, brought him to Oxford to run a number of seminars with students in the college and the university on it. Students had found a way of mining what was going on there and turning it to their advantage. If you poll British academics about the things that they are most proud of, they will all say the Open University. British academics are extraordinarily proud of the Open University, founded in the 1960s, the first distance learning supported institution, all through television technology. At the time, they fought it tooth and nail. I mean, these two propositions are absolutely true. You can go back into the historical record. But it was only because they were kind of drawn into it, not least through the possibility of extra moonlighting teaching possibilities, that it came to be absorbed into the culture. Now it is actually a very central part of what we do as a sector. So there may be avalanches, but we have quite a good way of sticking the straw through the snow and staying alive. Thanks.
Well, this is probably as good a conclusion as we can get. So would you please join me in congratulating and thanking our... Thank you. And so, David, I hate to think about the weight of this gift, but as a small memento of the University of Adelaide and the pleasure of your visit, please accept this gift on behalf of the university. Thank you.